presenting today. And like I said, I think I'm going to learn some things. So with that, Sandy, I'll turn it over to you to let you kind of introduce yourself.
There we go. Okay. So I am Sandy Henry. I had been in services, residential services with people with disabilities for over 40 years. I then, at the end of my career, spent about 10 years as a competitor of Dustin's, as he said, starting up with the Syngistics organization and kind of getting that launched. I retired in 2016, but remained passionate about the use of technology and have continued with ARM, as was mentioned before, ARRM, which is the Minnesota Provider Association. And I was one of the founding members of ARM's technology work group, and that has been running for many years now. Now, first of all, I'm just going to ask, please let me know if you can't hear me or if you have any trouble with the visuals. That will be very helpful. And Dustin, I'll count on you to call that out too, yeah, if that happens. So,
great.
Okay, good. So with the technology work group, one of the things that we spent the last several years doing is developing a website called the Technology Resource Center. And within that center, we have 5-course online learning, which is available to anyone. The technology resource is available to anyone, anywhere, and it's designed to be available and helpful to providers, families, individuals with disabilities, case managers, and so on. So I'm going to be using resources from that website and from our Tech 101 in today's session. Now, through that, we have identified 5 phases of implementing technology: the conversation, planning, funding, implementation, and measurement. Of that, we're going to focus today, obviously, on just the first phase, which is having the conversation. And I think it is the hardest phase. It's the phase that I think most teams get stuck in and all too often, unfortunately, end up giving up. And I think there are many reasons for that. One of the big reasons is that I think to earn teams' trust, and I'm talking about challenging teams here. I think you probably don't need any help or have many questions if you've got those teams who are already ready to go, open to technology, and have some background information. But here is where we're going to be talking about the more challenging teams. And I think it requires us to do things that are not natural to us as caregivers. And as I talk a little bit more and we go through some things, you'll see. One of the things I wanted to start with is just a very short video that's part of the Tech 101 course on conversations. So I am going to try to make that switch now. It's only about 2.5 minutes, and it kind of summarizes some of the elements there. Essentially, what the video does, is it just gives a little bit of an introduction on the importance of the conversation and focusing on the person when you're having the conversation. So one of the things that I think is interesting is when having the conversation about the use of technology with teams, it's really, really important to not focus on the technology, but to focus on the person and to really treat it as the same way you would treat any other person-centered planning process, where you're focusing on what are the person's needs, what do they want, what are the risks associated with trying to achieve those goals with the person, and also then what are the things that you need to do to help minimize those risks. One of the things that the video talks about too is that it's important to know your audience, which I'm going to make the assumption that you all do know your audiences. And as I said, you might have some teams that are ready to go and ready to move forward with technology, but I don't think you're here to talk about those. So I'm going to really concentrate on those teams that are going to be challenging, where the teams really may not know much about technology and may be quite fearful. And one of the things to be clear about is that when teams are fearful and reluctant to move forward on technology, it's not so much the technology that they're fearful about. It's the changes in the human support plan that go along with that. Because the use of technology is really all about how we can help the person become more self-dependent and be able to do more and control more in their life with a reduced or changed intervention, assistance, and physical presence of human caregivers. So one of the resources within the Tech 101 is, and it's part of the conversation course, is just a simple sheet of do's and don'ts for your initial conversation with people about the utilization of technology and how you might be able to modify the support plan to help the person be more self-dependent. And I use the term self-dependent because I think when we talk about being independent, it too often gives the impression that the person is going to be doing something completely on their own. And when we're talking about these uses of technology, it's always a combination of what the person really truly may be able to do on their own, maybe with some additional training, the use of technology, and the involvement of staff or some other caregiver. So with that, I'm going to talk about just the do's and don'ts and kind of go through them in 3 phases. And as I go through those, at the end of each phase, I'm going to stop for questions and comments. Since we have a nice small group today, I think it will be helpful, and hopefully we'll be able to really have some discussion and kind of find out what questions you have or what experiences that you have had. So as I said, remembering that the fear is usually based on the changes that you're going to be making to the support plan, the fear that you're going to be proposing removing or reducing staff on site or making changes there rather than the technology itself. So the whole goal of this part of implementing the technology in the conversation is really to get the team from where they're starting and just beginning to learn about this, just to get them to the point where they're able to say, all right, if all of these things are met, and if you can provide a way to meet these expectations, then we'll be willing to consider making changes to the support team. So in the conversation, you're not talking about what technology might be used. You're not planning it. You're not talking about what vendors you're going to use. You are simply trying to get the team to the point where they're willing to even have consider making those changes. And through that process, we need to get the team to identify, if we made changes to the support plan, what are the risks involved with the individual, and then what needs to be done to help minimize those risks so that we're at a safety level that's relatively equal to or better than if we have a caregiver on site. Okay, so with that, I've identified through kind of 3 phases to having that conversation. One is the pre-meeting, and that pre-meeting is really very similar to any other support plan. So it's obviously what happens before you really have a sit down with the rest of the team. And it's working with the individual and with the caregivers closest to the individual to try to identify those things that the person might want to do or need to do with less caregiver involvement, intervention, assistance, and or physical presence. So those things might be goals or means to an end or an end in and of themselves. The second phase is where you are sitting down talking with the team members themselves. And I call this identifying the what ifs. It really is identifying and getting as specific as we can to what are the fears that the team members have. And generally those tend to come out as what ifs. What if there's a fire? What if somebody breaks in? And trying to get those to be as specific as possible. So we're going from the big whopping fears of that's just going to be too dangerous, that won't be safe, down to what are the specific what ifs that we can then begin to address. The third phase then is going back to that list of what ifs and identifying what does the team need to see that would help them feel comfortable that level of safety could be met, or that the risk minimization is similar to if you have a caregiver present. And to do that, we need to have it be as specific as possible. And of course, it's after that phase 3 that we want to get to the team to the point where they're saying that if for each of these risks or what ifs, these things could be met. There's means to do these. In other words, either through training and the person demonstrating a skill, through the use of technology and or staff involvement, through some combination of those things. If those things can be met, then we'd be comfortable considering changes to the support team. One of the biggest errors that I think people make, because it's what we do as caregivers, is trying to allay people's fears or trying to answer questions too soon. So in this conversation, particularly where you've got people who are starting out very fearful, very skeptical, it's really all about focusing on identifying the risks and what does a team need to see to get past that. Okay, so we'll start with phase 1 and the do's and don'ts there. Now, as I said before, this is really like very similar to any other person-centered planning process. So one of the things you want to do before then, of course, is, and I'm sure you've all done this, this is why you're here, is educate yourself generally on the uses of technology. So obviously you're aware of what's possible. You're probably not going to be having this conversation without having some knowledge of that and some sense that the use of technology could be helpful for this individual. You also want to educate yourself on the relevant rules and funding so you have some sense of what is possible in your particular location. But then you want to work with the individual, work with their immediate caregivers to really try to identify what are those things that he or she would like to do with less caregiver presence, intervention, and or assistance. And those are the 3 things we're looking at. And this is where I, again, focus on the term self-dependence and what does the person want to be able to do for themselves rather than independence. Because for most of these individuals, they're still going to need some type of assistance, support, supervision from a caregiver, whether that person has to be physically present or not. Now, the things that the person might need or want to do, as I said, might be goals in and of themselves. They don't want, and we're going to use a couple of examples today, but they might not want to have staff coming into their room every 30 minutes to check on them for safety reasons, simply because they want more privacy and dignity. Or they might be things they need to do. They might be a means to another end. The person wants to live in their own apartment, and in order to do that, they need to be able to do things without the direct intervention of a caregiver. The big don't for this pre-meeting is don't find cool technology, make a decision that you want to use it, and then go in and try to propose it to the person and or to the team. If you do that, and if you talk about technology and talk about your excitement about certain technologies too soon, and in this meeting, it's too easy for you to come across as trying to sell or push the individual or the team in a direction. And that all too often is going to end up with people really digging their heels in. So I'm going to really focus on the fact that we're going to focus on the person through this, what their goals are, what the risks are, and what things need to be accomplished to minimize those risks. And that will hopefully get us to the point where we're prepared to start talking about the planning phase. All right, so I've got a couple of individuals that I'd like you to meet who have gone through this process. This is Jake. Jake lives in a licensed residential setting with 3 other individuals, and they have 24/7 staff. Jake, over the last number of years, has really developed mobility issues, and he's really declined. He now uses a wheelchair whenever he's in the community, and he uses a walker at home, or he's supposed to use a walker at home. He sometimes forgets, sometimes thinks that, well, I just am going to go over there to turn off the light, or it's just a few steps here. And sometimes he can do that without the walker and make it back to his chair or his bed safely, but not always. So he has a very high fall risk. His staff are currently doing a 30-minute check on Jake to, one, see if he has fallen and attend to him if that is the case, but also to check in to see if he needs something, wants something, needs assistance going to the bathroom, various things like that, and helping him there. Basically, Jake's goals are pretty simple. He wants more privacy and control in his current group living situation, particularly when he's in his bedroom watching TV in his recliner or in his bed. He doesn't want staff poking their heads in every 30 minutes when he doesn't need them to. He wants to have that privacy that's there. He also doesn't like waiting for a half an hour when he needs something from staff if they're between those 30-minute checks and they're not immediately available to him. So some of the things with Jake that he might need assistance with, in addition to going to the bathroom, are things like turning on and off his lights, changing the TV channel. He has physical dexterity issues, so he can't use a standard remote. So staff are usually helping him with that, or getting or doing anything else in his particular room. Okay, so that's Jake's goals. This is Sally. Sally's goals are a little bit more complicated than Jake. She's 26. She lives with her parents right now, and her parents have been told her whole life that she is going to need 24/7 supervision, and they've always assumed that when she leaves their home, she's going to be going into a group home. Sally has a job at Walgreens where she works 30 hours a week, cleaning and stocking shelves. Sally also has a boyfriend who the parents like, and they've been together for about 2 years. He also has a job during the overnights doing cleaning and stocking shelves at a local grocery store. Sally's goals, as I said, a little bit more complicated. She doesn't want to live in a group home. She wants to live in her own apartment, maybe with a friend, maybe eventually with her boyfriend. She knows she's going to need assistance doing things, so she knows she's going to need staff or family help with some things, and she's fine with that, but she doesn't want to have somebody around all the time. She wants to have that help and support when she needs it, and then she wants to be able to be on her own beyond that. So we've identified the wants and needs for these 2 individuals. So in this part where you're meeting with the team, I think this part, identifying the what ifs or the risks, is it's the hardest part of the conversation, and it is the most important part for a number of reasons. One of the things you want to establish here is gaining the team's trust. And the trust you need to gain here is the trust that until or unless you have identified and have a plan to address the safety needs of the individual to minimize the risks, then unless and until you have a plan that the team agrees with, that it's an adequate plan to do that, there will be no changes made to the support plan. And that is critical. And it's the kind of thing that you are going to need to clarify with them repeatedly, that we're going to identify what we think the risks are if we can do as Jake and or Sally or whoever is asking to be able to do. And then we're going to address what needs to occur. And only when and if we come up with a plan to address those adequately and the team agrees to it, only then will we be making changes to their human support plan. And you're going to need to repeat this multiple times every time somebody starts to get very concerned about it. And that's because, and you can do that assuredly, even though you may know that your plan is to go ahead with alternative overnight supervision. Fact is, you're not going to make changes. You're not going to change your staffing patterns unless you get agreement. Most states require consent from the team before you can do those changes. And if you try to go ahead and make changes to the support plan without the approval and the acceptance of the team, you're probably not going to be supporting that person for very long. So this is something you need to keep, you need to be very sure of when you're going into it, and you need to keep reminding your team that we're going to get all of the concerns out, we're going to identify all the risks, and we're going to come up with a plan, if we can, to minimize those risks using a combination of individual training and demonstrated skills, technology, and or staff involvement, or usually a combination thereof. So this is really important to keep in mind. You do want to assist the person, obviously, in communicating however they can, what it is they want. You want to help Jake talk about not wanting to have the staff come in his room, but also not wanting to have to wait when he needs something, and to help Sally talk about what she really wants to have. The big part of this, the other one, big part of this is going to be asking a lot of questions. One of the things that we tend to do in meetings is we want to give answers to people. We usually do our research. We usually come to the meeting with some solutions we want to recommend. And then we try to reassure people that, that this is going to work. And that's not what you want to do in this case. If you start to give answers, and they'll ask you questions. If you lay out there that Sally wants to live in her own apartment and they start identifying fears, they're going to want to know, is there a way to deal with that? And I'm going to suggest that you resist as much as you can to not go there, because if you start addressing and giving answers, like examples of technology that might help with a stove fire or things like that, it's too easy to get distracted. And it's too easy for you to come across as trying to sell them on the use of technology and or push them in that direction. And you need to keep them focused on what are their concerns. One of the big challenges here is very often they're going to start with really big, nebulous, vague fears, like it's just too dangerous. She can't live in her own apartment. And your job is, through asking various questions, is to try to get those fears down to bite-sized risks that you can then do planning around. Taking it from what if there's a fire down to some of the more specific things that might be related to that individual, such as maybe one of the concerns is that the person might leave the stove unattended, and that might start a fire. So as you go through, you're constantly asking questions to get those big fears down to things that are really specific to the individual. And then you're going to write them down. Every time you get a risk to a point that is something that we can really talk about how to address it, you want to write it down. And I literally suggest writing it down. It creates a visual that you really are listening and you're taking their fears and their concerns seriously. Now, you're definitely going to get some fears and concerns that are going to sound unreasonable. I've heard things such as with gentleman in his 30s, no risk of heart attack, no high blood pressure, no indications. The fear that, well, if we don't have staff on site at night, what if he has a heart attack and dies during the night? And you have to be very careful, again, not to minimize that, not to go on the defensive or put the team member on the defensive by saying, well, but he doesn't have any risk of heart attack. He's not more likely to have a heart attack, than anyone else. You acknowledge it. If that's their fear, you acknowledge it. You can ask questions to try to clarify it about, maybe you might be able to get it down to a question of what if he has a health concern during the night, down to some of the more reasonable ones. But that's where you're asking questions to get the team there. In a lot of cases, when they come up with some of those pretty outrageous, unreasonable fears and concerns, by asking questions, you can get them down to something that really is more reasonable. But if you can't, write it down. What if he has a massive heart attack during the night and dies? And don't fall to the temptation that I've seen people fall to, which is, well, the same thing's going to happen as if we have staff on site, he's going to die. That's not what you want to do there, obviously. You want to write it down when it gets to that point. Okay, so the big don'ts here is don't try to answer their what ifs. If they come up with a what if there's a fire, don't start answering that question for them, and don't try to allay their fears. Just write it down. You're going to, by writing it down, by getting it there, you're going to be acknowledging that you have heard them and that you've understood what that fear is, and you'll get back to talking about what to do about that a little bit later. You don't want to disagree with them. Again, these two really are the same. You don't want to minimize their fears or try to reassure them in any way or even disagree with them. You want to acknowledge it, and even if it is something that you can't get beyond, something that's reasonable, write it down. One of the options, and will happen with a number of meetings, you may get to a point where you can't go any further because there are fears that you aren't going to be able to do anything about. And that's okay. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. Okay, so let's look at our examples once again. Jake, what are the teams with Jake? Well, Jake's, again, pretty simple. So the what ifs for Jake are really the same reasons that they're doing 30-minute checks right now. What if he tries to get out of bed or out of his recliner in his room, no one's present, and he falls? Okay, that's pretty reasonable. Now, that might have started off with a team member saying, well, that's not safe. He's, if he falls, that's just too dangerous to do that, where you get it down to the specifics. What if he wants the TV channel changed and staff are too busy and they're not regularly checking on him? And what if he wants to go to sleep, turn his light off? So again, with him, it becomes a little bit more simple. Sally's are a little bit more complicated because she's interested in a bigger move. So one of the things that might end up with, what if she leaves the stove on and goes to bed, or leaves the stove unattended? That might have started off with, what if there's a fire? Or it might have started off with saying, well, she can't live in her own apartment because she can't do her own cooking. By asking questions such as, well, is Sally doing any cooking now? The answer might come back, yeah. Well, she is, but we have to be there with her all the time. We don't let her use the stove if we're not right with her. Well, why is that? What's your concern about her using the stove? Then you might be able to get to something like, well, she gets distracted easily and she'll be cooking. If she gets a phone call, she just goes in the other room and she forgets it. So that's a concrete thing you can work with. Okay, what if she leaves the stove on? What if she lets someone into her apartment who might abuse her or worse? That might start off with something like, well, what if she gets attacked in her apartment? And kind of gradually working down to, do you mean if somebody breaks in at night, like they might do at my house or your house? Well, yeah, that might be a concern. Okay, we'll write that down. Is there something else about Sally's skills or her tendencies that you think would leave her more vulnerable to being attacked? Then you might get down to, well, yeah, she's, so social and so interested in people, she just let anybody in. Okay, that's something we can work with. So let's move on from there. Stays up too late, sleeps. Again, that might start with, she'll lose her job. She can't get herself up. So then we can kind of bring that down to what are the specific things that we need to address. Taking medications would be another one, which can be pretty obvious. So we're taking things that might have started very broad and working them down into something more specific. Okay, I'm going to stop here for questions and comments.
Yeah, so everyone, please feel free to come off. I have a question to kind of get us going. And so as you're having this conversation with the team about the what ifs, it almost feels like there has to be some sort of assumption by the team that we're discussing this change in the person's life, right? So there has to be some change that is kind of framing and getting people to the what ifs and their concerns. Does that make sense? And how do you do that? Because you can't walk in saying, we want to not have staff in the home at night anymore. Or do you do that at the beginning of that conversation? And that is kind of the frame by which people need to start thinking about their what ifs and their concerns. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and part of that is going to be kind of in that pre-meeting where you're talking with the individuals. But you're right, you've got to have technology or a goal in mind. And ideally, through the person-centered process, that's going to come from them. So if, for example, in Jake's situation, it was that would not be appropriate, but let's say, yeah, it is something like alternative overnight supervision. Obviously, that's something that you're going to be talking with the whole team about, but you will have started by talking with each individual about their thoughts and feelings about that, and about what do they think about not having a staff person there at night. If we have enough time, and if I get the video to work, or I'd like to show a short video kind of about that process. But yeah, you're starting there, but that's where then you're in that pre-meeting, helping the person to identify that, yeah, I'd like to be here without staff at night. I don't usually need staff at night. They're just sleeping. And so you're kind of starting with, what does the person want to do on their own? And what would be the change in their life? In Sally's case, it would be moving out of mom and dad's house into an apartment versus a group home. In Jake's case, he's asking to not have the 30-minute checks. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Yeah, I was trying to figure out yeah, it absolutely does. We do have another question in the chat, and Brenda, I'm not sure that if I 100% understand this, but Brenda had a question. Would we be monitoring? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's like, okay, we normally would write out a behavior plan or ISP for someone, and being something new to them, how would we monitor and make sure that they completed the goal? Because this looks like a goal to me. And so would it be this, how you start off ISP? You do it for so many days, and then we see how it goes, and are they learning the technology? So in a way where they will be able to complete the goal and they don't need us, or they need us a little bit?
So in this process, for example, this is kind of like when you're having this conversation with teams that are very fearful, you just have to get them to the point of even considering what the plan might be.
Okay.
But eventually, once you get through these next steps, then you're going to move to planning, like what technology might be there. For somebody like Sally, the ISP is probably going to end up being whatever combination of technology and Sally developing her skills that occurs. She might very well have a goal while she's still living with her parents to implement technology that would turn off the stove and allow her to do some cooking without her parents being present. So each of these might be individual goals. The same with Jake. If we find technology that can help him, there would probably be then ISP goals and plans teaching him skills that he needs to develop to utilize technology as we move forward. So each one of these kind of risks would probably end up being part of a goal and a plan all the way down the line. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I can see from Sally's situation where if she's applying the technology as almost like practicing at her mom's, then it could lead for her, independence, or you say self-dependence.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she, with the use of technology, whatever would be in play in her own apartment, may need to demonstrate that she can get herself up and off to work on time without her parents waking her up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's a long-term.
Yes.
Long-term plan. Okay.
Yeah, depending now, Jake's might be more short-term.
Yes.
But something like Sally's not.
Okay.
And
right.
real quick, the tech plan that we have built into Shift is a document and a process by which you would, as Sandy was kind of saying, document, if we're using this tech, here's the goal of it. Here's the person that's going to be doing these frequent reviews. Here's how the reviews are going to be done. And then here's how the team is going to, give input into any modification. So the tech plan that we have built into the Shift curriculum is an area where you could outline those things, which is kind of what Sandy was saying. And it becomes a part of the ISP, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So us, as the tech person, will be supporting the people that we serve when they choose a particular plan.
Yeah, but until you can get the teams willing to even consider that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it.
Okay.
Got our people over here in DC, we're about that. I believe that we have a number of people that could benefit.
Great.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Brenda.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Just a quick clarifying question for me at this point when you're using the terminology team, who are you all including in this conversation as team? Because from working with the MCO, team has a different connotation to me than what you might be implying in this person. I'm going to guess, and I don't want to make that assumption, so I'm asking the clarification that the team is the member, the financial supports, paid supports. So I just want to clarify who you're identifying as team at this point.
It would be the individual being supported. There are paid supports, family, case manager. Those would generally be the team members.
Right.
And so this kind of technique could be used whether you're a case manager who is trying to introduce this, whether you are a service provider, or you might be even a family member who is trying to get your providers to move forward.
Yeah, because because right now I support teams, which would be the case manager and the nurse, who then support what we would refer to the members, which would be the individuals. So I just want to clarify that I was understanding who you were identifying as teams in this conversation, but I do understand the application all the way across, and it's just a little bit of nuances in who's initiating conversations.
And this same technique can be used because a lot of times the first people you have to convince, if you're a service provider, first people you have to convince are your staff. And they may be the first ones that you're running into resistance with. That again, you go down with them and say, okay, let's take a look at what are your concerns about if you want to implement alternative overnight supervision, remote support at night with each person, what are your specific concerns? Okay. All right. Anything else, Dustin? Otherwise, we'll move on to the phase 3.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thank you.
This next one can be, I think, the exciting one, because now what we want to do, now that we got all of the fears and the what ifs down, is to go back and for each one of those, which is by going back to each one of those now, you're also reinforcing to the team that you heard their fear and their concern. And we want to go back and to say, okay, what needs to be in place? Not the technology thing, but what do we need to address in order for you to feel comfortable that the level of safety that we currently have in place could be met if we made these changes in the human support side of it. And one of the ways to get at that is to ask, what would an on-site caregiver do right now about that particular risk? So by asking that question, in Jake's case, his what if he falls, instead of allowing the team to come back and say, well, we have to prevent him from falling. Well, the reality is staff on site doing 30-minute checks isn't preventing him from falling now. So by asking, okay, what is it that the staff on site are currently doing to manage or to minimize Jake's risk from falling? And by starting to do that, we can kind of get to some of those lists. Through that, we want to help the team to get to the point of trying to see that somehow through the combination of education of the individual and them demonstrating their skills through the use of technology and through involvement of support staff, that what would we need to satisfy? And I think when I get to the examples, that may be a little bit more clear. Part of what you hopefully will be doing as you're getting through this is leading the team to the point where they can begin to see that even with an on-site caregivers, you're not eliminating all risks, you're minimizing them. And that you're trying to get with this new combination and support plan to a place where you're hitting that same bar of minimizing risk. The things you don't want to do, again, kind of repeats in what if, is to dismiss any of the what ifs, any of the concerns as being unreasonable. And you may be coming back to address some of those more unreasonable concerns with this, like what happens if, let's say, somebody without any risk of heart attack has a massive heart attack during the night. This is a really good place to be able to revisit that and say, okay, what happens with staff now? And when people can honestly answer that, what they're going to see is, well, particularly if you've got sleep staff on site or staff aren't doing a pulse check every so often, even a staff on site might not be able to know that that's going to happen. So it's a way to kind of start getting a little bit more realistic on expectations. You also don't want to give up too early. These are some really hard things for teams who have never thought about this, for teams who are team members who are very resistant to this. There's a very good chance you're not going to get through this in one meeting. So you may need to just say, okay, well, we've identified a lot of these things. Let's put it aside, think about it, and come back to it at another meeting. Or let me give some more thought to this and see if I can kind of come back and summarize it for you later. So you're not giving up, but you're also not trying to drag it out and push the team faster than they really can go. And don't take it personal. There are going to be some members that are just never going to get there. And if there are people who are important to the individual being supported, then you may just have to wait and bring it back next year. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of states who require conversations require them to be held at least annually. Okay, so what did Jake's team come to with their plan? So the first what if he tries to get out of bed? Well, right now there's two outcomes. If he doesn't fall and he gets back into bed or his chair safely, staff do nothing. Then they might not even know about it. If he does fall, when staff do their checks, they're going to find him, see if he's injured, help him back to better his chair. So therefore, we can kind of lead to say, okay, well, if staff aren't doing their regular 30-minute checks, then we need to have a means that will notify staff if Jake gets out of bed, or if Jake is out of bed or his chair for more than 5 minutes and doesn't get back in within those 5 minutes. So if staff get notified when that happens, they would then check on him to either assist him if he hasn't fallen and or to assist him if he has fallen. Hopefully one of the things that teams could see is that, well, if that could happen, he actually might be safer because they might be able to prevent some falls. If he wants to have his TV on, change the channel there or the lights or whatever. Right now, staff would do that when they do their 30-minute checks. Therefore, we need a way for Jake to be able to do those things for himself and or a way for him to notify staff without disturbing other people when he wants their help. And maybe we need to say, then the staff need to be able to come to him within 15 minutes so he's not waiting that 30-minute again. So we're trying to answer those questions in much more specific terms about what we would need to put in place without bringing out what the solutions are. And that's where you might get team members also saying, well, is there a way to do that? Well, how would we do that? I'm going to suggest you try to put that off to say, let's get all the things down that we need to do, because then the next step is moving into the planning phase where you try to answer those. With Sally, leaving the stove unattended. Right now we know that her parents are right there. So we say, okay, so when Sally's using the stove, what do you do if she leaves it unattended? They may say, well, we call her back and we make sure she turns it off, or we'll turn it off for her. Okay, so we need a method that if the stove is left on unattended, that Sally's going to get a notification and that we're going to be able to verify that she came back and turned it off, or a means to automatically turn off the stove when it is unattended. Letting someone into the apartment that she shouldn't. Well, that's what we can talk through right now. The parents are there. They're verifying who's at the front door, and they're making that decision. So we might need to have a means whereby Sally can verify who's at the door before she opens it. Sally may need some training and may need to demonstrate that she can make those decisions about who to let in and who not to let in. And maybe we also need to have, whenever the door opens when Sally's home alone, to have a remote caregiver notified that that door opened and have them have a means to check in to see that Sally is safe. Oversleeping. Right now, mom or dad basically maybe a reminder to go to bed on time, but then they're also checking every morning to make sure she's up, even though she has an alarm clock. And they say some days, she is getting up, but other days she's not. So we obviously need a means to make sure she's out of bed on time and that she leaves on time to catch her bus, and to let a caregiver know if that doesn't happen. So, doesn't take her medication. By asking questions, we find out that Sally and her mom set up a MediSet every week. Sally's capable of taking those medications, but right now, mom always just automatically reminds her and then watches her take them to make sure she did. So that can be translated into, we need a means to remind Sally to take her medications, to verify that she did, And maybe, at least initially, the team said, well, they want somebody watching her actually take them. So those would be some of the specifics that we might come to for Sally. So what I'd like to do is stop here for questions. I don't think we'll have time for the last video, but we do have time for some questions or comments here.
I'll kick us off again, but everybody else, please feel free to jump in. So one of the things that kind of jumped out to me was you were talking about people, the person on the team that they're, because you may have 4 or 5 people on the team. One person is just dead set against it because of their personal beliefs that may not be valid. I hate to say it like that, but how do you suggest you handle those situations? And then I guess kind of a second question kind of related to it is, do you ever see a situation where having individual conversations with a team member would be better than having the whole group together as you're discussing some things?
I think that, yeah, that is very, that's an excellent suggestion. Part of what you want to do is obviously know your team members. So maybe you've got a parent that you think is really going to be skeptical. So you want to maybe first meet with the case manager, make sure that the case manager kind of gets there. And some of these conversations might be better done individually with team members before you bring them together in a group. That's an excellent suggestion, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Sandy, I think I found the video that you were trying to play.
Okay. I think I'm going to hold off on that, yeah.
Okay.
We're kind of past it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know if you find the other one, I don't think we'll have time for it, but any other questions?
Is it remote support? It starts with a
conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
What I'll do is I will get a link to that and throw it in the chat for everybody so that.
Okay.
Sandy and Dustin, thank you so much for this presentation. One of my takeaways is that a lot of this is actually about emotional intelligence more than it is about knowing about technology. And it's about managing the feelings of all the people involved. There's a lot of acknowledging, and there's a lot of respect, showing respect for each person's autonomy. So that was my thought, and I guess my question is, what do you recommend if somebody who's in the position of leading the conversation might not be naturally the most emotionally, I don't know what, savvy person?
Yeah. Well, I think usually people who are going to be leading teams are going to have some of those skills. It really is, as you said, it's also change management. Yeah. That you're going to try to make a change, and that's what's difficult. Change is always very hard for people. And I think for most people who are going to be in this position as a caregiver, the hardest part is not answering the questions right up front, not having the solutions that you're then going to try to reassure them that we can meet those answers with. Would you agree with that, Dustin, or would others agree with that?
Yeah.
Usually you've got people who are pretty sensitive, pretty empathetic, leading these discussions, but managing the change and dealing with the conflict is what's difficult. And so this is really about, for those people who are going to be resistive, to kind of bring them along with you rather than to force a change on them.
Great point.
Okay, it's me again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Piggybacking off of the young lady's comments, what I'm thinking of a cannot do versus a can do attitude. And if we're talking to a team member that has fear of the technology, that they relate to themselves and try to put it on our people, that can be a challenge, you think? Because like you say, you can always have that one person that opposes what we're trying to,
Yep.
yeah.
I think so. One of the things with this part of the process is, if it is a fear of the technology, we're not even talking about the technology yet.
Right.
We're just talking about team, what do you need to see?
Right.
Now, when we say, well, we would need something that was going to shut that stove off if Sally left it unattended, they may say, well, what is there such a thing? And is that trustworthy? And is that, and here's where, and this is where it kind of becomes delicate, where for this part of it, you're trying to say, we'll look into that. There might be technology that can do that. I think there might be. But right now, let's just make sure that we agree that if we could find something that could do this, then you'd be willing to let Sally cook without you being there, without a caregiver being present, and trying to keep people focused on that. Because if you can get through this, again, like any change management, now you have a list of tasks that you can now go out and see if you can find solutions for, even if you've got some in the back of your head. And they've already kind of made the commitment that if you can do these things, then we're willing to look at that next step, that big scary change of what's out there.
And I think that the fear of tech in people's mind, once you get to that point in the conversation, to Sandy's point, that fear of tech is the person envisioning, a month in the future where things are totally different, right? And they are probably missing the steps that you and the team would put together to slowly phase in that technology in a controlled manner, so that you as the team are then controlling the risk that you've identified. And you need to work with the team to make sure that they understand that, we're not just going to flip a switch and make this major change. There's going to be steps that we as a team put together.
Right.
Yeah. And so in the conversation, you've broken it down to kind of bite-sized pieces. And again, you're continuing to reassure them, if we can't come up with something that the team agrees adequately addresses these, then we're not going to move forward. And they need to know that you can accept that. When you're done with this, you're ready for planning. And the big thing I want to say there is, the only thing I want to is call in the experts. Even if you are an expert on technology, call in the vendors, call in other providers who have done this, other people who have done this. Let them help sell the technology and the solutions, so that you're not the one in the position that can come across as looking like you're just trying to push this so you can cut your staffing. And there's a lot of good resources there. If you don't know about it, every state has an Assistive Technology Act program that's federally funded, and you can find your states there. Excellent resources. The Disability Cocoon website, Assistive Technology, and others are great places to find out who are some possible vendors. Are there mentors in your area? Various things like that.
And I would also recommend that you go through Shift. In the Shift platform, we have the Ask an Expert kind of chat functionality. And if you throw a question in there around something, then somebody from Shift, and in the future, what we envision is this community of people like you that have gone through the Shift curriculum and are implementing things like we discussed today. Everybody will be able to chime in and have a conversation with inside of Shift to share best ideas and best practices. So.
Yeah. Technology vendors, whether it's one of these assistive technology ones, whether it can be lending libraries, but technology vendors, I don't know of a vendor or a consultant who won't do some for free consultation, won't meet with family members or teams to kind of talk about what they have. And so again, excellent resources when you get to the point that you know what you need to accomplish. And once you've got your list from the conversation, you've got a list you can take to vendors or to people to say, I need something that can do this. Do you have any way to help a person do this? So it's very, very specific. The video I was going to show is just this one, which is about 4 individuals where they implemented remote support at night. But the key is there's interviews with families, in particular one mom who was very reluctant initially, and how they got through the process as a team. So, but I know we're already past 1 o'clock.
Okay.
So there's my contact information. If there's anything I can assist people with, I'm always happy to do that, as I know Dustin is. So
Yeah, absolutely.
thank you so much for your time, and thank you, Dustin.
Sandy, that was amazing. Thank you very much. I'm sure that I'll be reaching out to you to help us with some other things. Like I've told you, I'm never going to let you fully retire. So you're way too valuable.